In late spring of 1838, as the deadline for removal passed, General Winfield Scott arrived in Georgia with 7,000 soldiers. His orders were to remove the Cherokee by any means necessary.
Think of this, my Cherokee brethren. I am an old warrior and have been present at many a scene of slaughter. But spare me, I beseech you, the horror of witnessing the destruction of the Cherokees. Do not even wait for the close approach of the troops. General Winfield Scott.
On the morning of May 26, 1838, 3 days after the removal deadline, federal troops and state militia began what they called the Assembly of the Cherokee people.
Everything that wasn't actually on the person now belonged to the state. And they were forced out into yards and on to the roads with whatever they had on their back.
There were staging areas around the Cherokee Nation with wooden stockades. And the people were herded into what were literally cattle pens.
Come on, keep moving.
A few weeks after the roundup began, the first detachments of Cherokees were shipped west under military guard. Word quickly got back to the stockades. Drought and summer disease had made the trip a march of death. A few hundred Cherokees who agreed to renounce tribal citizenship were allowed to remain on their farms in North Carolina. The rest, more than 12,000 captive Cherokees, waited in the fetid stockades. Prisoners, one missionary remembered, were obliged to lie at night on the naked ground, in the open air, exposed to wind and rain. And in this way, many are hastening to a premature grave. Half the infants and all the aged have died directly, and 1/4 of the remainder.
We have been made prisoners by your men. But we do not fight against you. We have never done you any harm. We are Indians. We have hearts that feel. We do not want to die. We are in trouble, sir. Our hearts are very heavy, very heavy. We cannot make talk. Cherokee Council.
Through June, July, August, and September, they waited. Until, at the beginning of October, the Cherokee Nation was finally pushed west. It was early December before the final group began the 850-mile trip. By then, the long line of Cherokee travelers stretched from Illinois into Kentucky, unbroken in places for 3 miles. John Ross had seen that the detachments were well supplied for the 3 to 4 month trek. But winter storms made the Mississippi and Ohio rivers impassable, stranding thousands for a full month.
No one could have predicted that one of the hardest winters in memory would strike that year. When they reached the Mississippi River, the river was frozen. There were 3 different detachments trapped between the Mississippi and another river frozen behind them. And there they sat for weeks in deep, deep snow and ice.
When you actually had to wait for the ice and sit there, and maybe you're sleeping on snow, but you're probably sleeping on melted mud. And you're sick, your baby's sick, your grandmother's sick, and there's nothing you can do about it.
The harsh weather so slowed progress that supplies of dried corn and salt pork began to run short. When white settlers along the road recognized the Cherokees' need, a few offered help. Others took the opportunity to cash in on the woe, charging wildly inflated prices for grain. Cherokee men were soon too depleted to hunt wild game. A New Englander passing through western Kentucky noted the sad procession. 2,000 people, sick and feeble, many near death. One woman was carrying her youngest child who was dying in her arms. Multitudes go on foot. Even aged females were traveling with heavy burdens attached to their back, on sometimes frozen ground, with no covering for the feet except what nature had given them. The Indians buried 14 or 15 at every stopping place.
U.S. Army Private John G. Burnett writes,
"The sufferings of the Cherokee were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. They slept in the wagons and on the ground without fire. I saw as many as 20 die in a single night of pneumonia, cold, exposure."
Move along. Move along.
Because of the Civilization Project, a great many of those coming on the trail were Christians. And a lot of times on the trail, they would sing Christian hymns. Here, these thousands of people making this forced march, 1/4 of them dying en route. And they're singing, "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, guide me, God. Pilgrim that I am in this barren land. I am weak, and you are mighty. Guide us."
The United States gained a lot of land and farms and taverns and ferries and things like that. But a loss for the American government is the blemish, the stain it places upon our national honor. What we did in the 1830s to the southeastern Indians, it's ethnic cleansing.
People sometimes say I look like I never smile. Most of the time, I keep thinking of the old nation and wonder how the big mountain now looks in springtime, and how the boys and young men used to swim in the big river. And then there comes before me the picture of the march. Maybe someday we will understand why the Cherokees had to suffer.
Seven months later, in the new Oklahoma Indian Territory, Major Ridge, his son, and nephew, who had all signed the removal treaty, were assassinated for selling the Cherokee homelands.
By 1860, After a quarter century it removed from the United States, Ross had managed to restore the heart of his nation. Its government had been reconstituted. Its businesses flourished. It had the finest system of public education in all America, for men and women. Cherokee population had nearly doubled to 21,000. Ancient tribal traditions, like the green corn dance and the clan system, were still honored. John Ross was in his 70s, had been chief nearly 40 years, when, after the Civil War, the United States began to force its way, once again, into Cherokee territory, demanding the tribe cede part of its western lands. In the summer of 1866, while he was in Washington negotiating anew with the U.S., John Ross fell ill. As he neared death, Ross knew the Cherokee Nation faced big challenges in the coming years and new kinds of encroachments. But the chief took comfort in the fact that the Cherokees had reestablished themselves as a strong and sovereign nation, deeply connected to the land on which they lived, and prepared to fight for it.
In this one respect, they're lucky. In that, where they came to looks kind of like where they left. They look at the hills here and they say, those look like the hills in old Cherokee country. They must have been carved out by the same buzzard that carved out the Smokies. And they look at the scratches in the rock and they say, those look just like the scratches in the rock made by the Uctana back in Georgia. They must have been made by the Uctana here too. Part Cherokee writer Scott Mamade talks about stories in the blood or memory in the blood. The stories are told generation after generation, so that in many ways they are carried in our blood. And although I don't know what it was like to make that march, my ancestors did come on the trail. I've heard the stories.
In listening to the stories of your ancestors, you're taught who you are and what your ancestors sacrificed so that you could be Cherokee.